Let's start off with the Thursday night game. It was the Jets visiting the Patriots. It was a low-scoring affair that ended in a 13-10 Patriots win. The matchup didn't bring many fantasy numbers. Tom Brady had a subpar performance for Tom Brady, only managing 185 yards through the air. He was able to find Julian Edelman 13 times for 78 yards. With Danny Amendola out for an unknown period of time, Edelman is a good bet to see a lot of targets. He has even greater value in PPR formats and should be owned in all leagues. As for the running game, Stephen Ridley has been anything but impressive. He had 16 carries but only managed to muster 40 yards. Right now his job is pretty secure with Shane Breen out until week 11, and LeGarrette Blount appears to be no real threat to take away from his workload. Patience could be a virtue for Ridley's owners. However, knowing Bill Belichick, anything can happen. Meanwhile, the Jets continue to be fantasy kryptonite. Geno Smith looked anything but sharp, throwing for 214 yards with 3 costly turnovers. The running back situation didn't get any clearer, with Bilal Powell getting 13 carries to Chris Ivory's 12. Both players rushed over for 40 yards, but Bilal had the difference-making touchdown. The running game situation is too hit or miss with these backs. It's somewhat reminiscent of D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart from the last couple years. At this point, it's hard to imagine either back running away with the job. For our next matchup, we head to Atlanta where the Falcons defeated the St. Louis Rams 31-24. Sam Bradford continued to grow as a quarterback, throwing for over 300 yards and 3 scores. Dale Richardson has been encouraging in the backfield. He hasn't exploded for many rushing yards so far, but he has put up quite impressive numbers as a pass catcher in Jeff Fisher's system. Rookie Tavon Austin enjoyed his best game of his young career, scoring twice off 6 catches. The sky's the limit for Austin, whose speed and explosiveness make him a threat to put up big numbers in any given week. For the Falcons, Matt Ryan was sharp in this one, throwing for 374 yards with 2 scores, one of which was an 81-yard bomb to Julio Jones, who himself had a fantastic day with 182 yards and 11 catches. With Roddy White nursing an injury relegated to decoy status, Jones joins Ryan as a top 5 player at his position. The injury bug hit the Falcons again when Steven Jackson left the game after scoring an 8-yard pass from Ryan. Initial reports say Jackson suffered a thigh bruise. However, more information is sure to come. In the event he does miss time, Jaquiz Rodgers and Jason Snug figure to take on Jackson's workload. Now let's move on to the Carolina Panthers visiting the Buffalo Bills. This young Bills squad continues to impress and came away with a 24-23 victory. Rookie quarterback E.J. Manuel started to come into his own early in his debut season, throwing just shy of 300 yards with 1 touchdown to his favorite target, Stevie Johnson. Manuel's looked good and is starting to show promise for those in need of a second quarterback in 2 quarterback leagues. C.J. Spiller made up for an okay performance in Week 1, rushing for 103 yards this week. The big story here, though, is that Fred Jackson is still very much involved in this offense. Over the offseason, many believe Spiller had assumed the feature back duties and would be fed the ball until he throws up. Jackson's heavy involvement in this offense shouldn't come as much as a shock. He's essentially the complement to CJ Spiller that in years past Spiller had been to Jackson. I strongly encourage picking up Jackson if he's available in your league. He's proven that as long as he's healthy, he can be highly productive, even at his age. For the Panthers, Cam Newton had a modest game, throwing for 229 yards and 2 scores. Newton has not been accumulating the rushing yards we have become accustomed to from him. I think it mostly stems from him trying to become a more efficient passer in the pocket. Unfortunately, if they keep losing games, it may eventually get his coach Ron Rivera fired. D'Angelo Williams had a solid running day, racking up 85 yards and 22 carries. I actually believe that Williams is a solid fantasy play each week. He's providing some consistency to the Panthers' run game that they just haven't had in some time. Ted Ginn also had a solid day on the field. The former Ohio State Buckeye had 3 catches for 62 yards and a touchdown, while also adding 100 return yards. The Vikings and Bears matchup came down to the final minute. The Bears barely escaped, helped by a game-clinching touchdown in the final minute. Jay Cutler has looked very much in control to start the season. He threw for 290 yards and 3 scores. 1 went to Brandon Marshall, while the other 2 went to Martellus Bennett. Bennett has shown in the first 2 weeks that he's more than capable of putting up solid numbers with Cutler throwing the ball to him. If you're weak at tight end right now, I'd consider going and grabbing Bennett off the waiver wire immediately. Seems like a wise choice, and he'll remain a strong tight end play each week. With regards to the run game, Matt Forte was excellent. He managed to pile up 90 yards on 19 rushes while also adding 11 receptions for 71 yards. Forte is showing glimpses of greatness early and could be in for a monster season whether it's PPR or not. Christian Ponder did not look very stellar in this one, but managed to keep the Vikes close. Adrian Peterson continued to show why he is one of the most dominant rushers in recent memory while rushing for 100 yards. Greg Jennings pulled in 5 catches for 84 yards, and right now has solidified his position as a very capable flex play each week. Next, let's go to the Packers versus the Redskins. The Packers laid a beating on the Redskins behind the arm of Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers proved once again why he's considered the premier fantasy quarterback to own. He threw for 480 yards and 4 touchdowns. At one point, he was on pace to throw for over 600 yards. Naturally, when Rodgers has a big game, so does the supporting cast. Randall Cobb continued to show how much improvement he's made since joining the league, with 9 catches for 128 yards and a touchdown. It would have been 2 touchdowns on the day for him had he not stepped out of bounds earlier. However, Jordy Nelson was able to come away with 2 touchdowns, as well as Jermichael Finley with another. James Jones also had 11 receptions for 178 yards. It was a very welcome sign after he laid a goose egg last week against the Niners. It wasn't all good news, however. Eddie Lacy left the game after his only rush ended with him getting a concussion, thus guaranteeing he wouldn't return. James Starks filled in admirably in his place, rushing for 132 yards while also adding 4 receptions for 36 yards. In doing this, he also became the first Packer running back to rush for over 100 yards since 2010. It looks like a safe bet that Lacy will be out for Week 3, especially with the Packers on bye the week after. In any case, Starks should be picked up by Lacy owners and non-Lacy owners alike. As running back on one of the best offenses in the league, the opportunities will be plenty. For the second week in a row, the Redskins once again struggled in the first half. Playing from behind yet again, RG3 had a much better second half, finishing with 320 yards and 3 scores. Of course, RG3 has made a living around garbage time scoring these last 2 weeks. It shouldn't be too concerning given his lack of preseason work, but if this trend continues, it might start to become a little disconcerting. Pierre Garçon did his best to help aid a possible comeback with 8 catches for 143 yards and a touchdown. When healthy, Garçon is capable of being a top 10 receiver, and he proved that this week with his performance. Alfred Morris ran for a very quiet 107 yards in this one, but for the second week in a row, the Skins were playing from behind. If the Skins can manage to stay competitive each week and not fall behind so quick, Morris will have his dominating days. Until then, we'll have to wait and see. In Indianapolis, the Dolphins were able to come away with a victory over the Colts to move to 2-0 on the season. Led by Ryan Tannehill's 319 passing yards, the young Dolphins took a big step towards competing in the AFC. Lamar Miller rebounded from an awful Week 1 performance by rushing for 69 yards and his first score. After receiving a lot of media scrutiny after his Week 1 disappearance, Mike Wallace answered the critics of his contract in a big way to the tune of 9 receptions for 150 yards and a touchdown. With Tannehill's big arm, there's no reason to not expect Wallace of being capable of attaining these numbers again. Charles Clay, while listed as a halfback, qualifies as a tight end in most leagues. He came away with 109 yards on 5 catches while also punching in a touchdown run from the 1-yard line. Clay presents some sneaky good value in low-risk, high-reward positions. If you're in need, there's no real reason not to take a shot on him. Andrew Luck and the Colts kept it close but couldn't hold on. Luck was solid, throwing for 321 yards and a score. One of the things I like about Luck is he's an underrated scrambling quarterback and is often able to find the holes needed to get the first down. Luck is going to be a fine quarterback this year and will assert himself as a mid to low end quarterback 1. Ahmad Bradshaw had a solid day, running for 65 yards on 15 carries. T.Y. Hilton came away with 124 receiving yards on 6 receptions. Couple that with an injury to Darius Hayward-Bay, and suddenly Hilton presents some serious wide receiver 2 ability. Reggie Wayne had a relatively quiet day, while Luck's old college pal, Kobe Fleener, had 4 catches for 69 yards and a touchdown. Dallas Cowboys came into Arrowhead to face the Chiefs. This one went to Andy Reid's Chiefs, and how about Alex Smith? Smith continues to win despite not putting up the sexiest numbers. In throwing over 200 yards for 2 scores, his most surprising stat comes via his 57 rushing yards, which were actually more than Jamal Charles' output on half as many carries. Charles was great in the receiving game yet again. this time with 8 receptions for 48 yards. As long as Andy Reid is the coach in Kansas City, Charles will see a heavy workload in both the running and passing games. Dwayne Bowe also finished with 4 receptions for 56 yards and a touchdown. As for the Cowboys, they fell short as Tony Romo threw for 298 yards and a touchdown. He had amazing chemistry with Dez Bryant, who came away with 9 catches for 141 yards and a score. The Cowboys are going to need the Romo-Bryant connection to be on point if they're serious about making an actual run to the Super Bowl. Expect big fantasy numbers between these two. DeMarco Murray was also very solid for the second week in a row, and his continued involvement in the passing game is a very welcome part of his game that really wasn't there last year. He's always an injury risk, but if we're going by just the first 2 games, Murray is well on his way to a fantastic season. Now we're going to go to my game of the week, the Chargers visiting the Eagles. This was a back-and-forth game full of offense led by 2 older quarterbacks who had lower expectations for them in years past, yet managed to both throw for over 400 yards. The Chargers managed to hold on to a 3-point win. Philip Rivers was phenomenal and is off to his best start in years. His 419 yards easily bested his yardage output from last week. He has also managed to revive the career of one Eddie Royal, who has been fantastic in his first 2 games. With 3 touchdowns in this one, Royal now has half as many touchdowns as he has catches this year. He should be owned in all leagues while he's hot. Another player looks like the player he used to be is Phillips' old buddy Antonio Gates, and he's looked good doing it. His workload this week consisted of 8 receptions for 124 yards. Michael Vick has looked very good under Chip Kelly's offense, but time will tell if his 33-year-old body will survive all 16 weeks, which has obviously been an issue in years past. But for the time being, go with the hot hand. Vick has also made Deshaun Jackson look very good this season, and this game was no exception. Jackson finished with an impressive line of 9 catches, 193 yards, and a touchdown. It's safe to say he's gotten back some of the spark that made him a fantasy beast years ago. LeSean McCoy continues to stake his claim as the number 1 running back in fantasy. A PPR monster, McCoy had 5 receptions for 114 yards to go along with 11 rushes for 53 yards. McCoy is firmly playing himself among the top 3 running backs in fantasy until further notice. Next, we go to AFC North rivals Browns and Ravens. The Ravens defense looked happy to see Brandon Weeden after the beating Peyton Manning put on him last week. The Ravens came away winners with a 14-6 victory. Joe Flacco threw the football half as much this week than he did against the Broncos last week and came away with 211 passing yards for 1 touchdown to rookie Marlon Brown, who looks like he's quickly embraced his role as the number 2 wide receiver behind Torrey Smith. Speaking of Smith, he finished with 7 receptions for 85 yards. He's clearly Flacco's go-to guy with Bolden gone. He's put up 80-plus yards in his first 2 games, but just hasn't found the end zone. Trust me, he eventually will, and he'll find it a lot. Ray Rice, however, was having a below-average game before an injury kept him out of the rest of it, at which point Bernard Pierce handled Rice's workload to the tune of 19 carries for 57 yards and a touchdown. It's definitely worth keeping an eye on Rice's status for next week. Pierce already had some built-in fantasy potential with Rice in the lineup. With Rice not in the lineup, it could mean very good things for Bernard Pierce this Sunday. Brandon Weeden was particularly pretty bad for Cleveland and left with an injury. They're not going to win a lot by the air, but Jordan Cameron put up a respectable line of 5 receptions for 95 yards. I personally like to think of Cameron as Jimmy Graham light, extra light that is. However, I do think he's one of the few tight ends in the league who are capable of taking over a game all by themselves. Unfortunately, getting the ball to him could be an even bigger issue. Trent Richardson was particularly average for the second week in a row. Richardson's a prime-time player stuck on a bad team. I have noticed that he has gotten better as a pass catcher, one of the few things he was knocked around for last year. Once again, it looks dismal in Cleveland, but I do think that the arrival of Josh Gordon from suspension could add some life to a Cleveland team that could already be falling into the dreaded territory of maybe next year? Next, we go to the Titans and Texans, which had the distinct honor of being the first game to go into overtime this year. Matt Schaub put in a solid day's work by throwing for 298 yards and 3 scores, one going to DeAndre Hopkins, while the other 2 were split between his 2 tight ends, Owen Daniels and Garrett Graham. Speaking of Hopkins, in only his second NFL game, the rookie had 7 receptions for 117 yards. showing just why the Houston Texans have such high hopes for him. Hopkins could easily challenge Tavon Austin for the honor of best rookie wide receiver this year. As for the Texans' two-headed monster of a running game, Arian Foster finished with 79 rushing yards on 19 carries and scored a crucial touchdown, while Ben Tate had 93 rushing yards thanks in part to a 60-yard run in the first quarter. Tate is a strong talent that unfortunately happens to play behind a great talent, but the Texans have made it clear they want to get him more carries. Tate will be a free agent after the season, and he'll land as a feature back somewhere in the league, but at the current time, Tate is a justifiable flex in most leagues. Jake Locker did an alright job against the Texans. He only managed 148 passing yards, but connected for 2 scores and handled the ball pretty well. Chris Johnson had a strong week, rushing for 96 yards on 25 carries. While he hasn't shown many glimpses of his old CJ2K self, Johnson's stats have been encouraging enough to start the season. I still think he's a very strong running back 2 right now, and you should feel comfortable starting him each week until proven otherwise. Kendall Wright shipped in a solid performance with 7 catches for 54 yards and his first touchdown of the season. Now let's take a look at the Detroit Lions visiting the Arizona Cardinals, which saw the home team come away with a 25-21 win. Now that they have a capable quarterback in Carson Palmer, the Cardinals have come back to fantasy relevance. After a very solid opener, which he scored twice, Larry Fitzgerald came back down to earth, finishing with 2 receptions for 33 yards. This could be attributed to Fitz being a game-time decision and being less than 80%. All signs point to him being good to go for next week. Feel confident starting him. Rashard Mendenhall had his best game since leaving Pittsburgh last year, rushing 15 times for 66 yards while adding 2 receptions for 28 yards. It's good to see Mendenhall catching passes, as that was something he rarely did during his time with the Steelers. The Lions fell short in this one. Matthew Stafford was efficient, however, throwing for 278 yards with 2 touchdowns, both of whom went to Calvin Johnson, with one of them being a 72-yard missile. Megatron ended with 16 catches for 116 yards. Reggie Bush looked good early on, but soon enough was hurt again and missed much of the second half, finishing with just 69 total yards. Reggie Bush is the ideal example of high risk, high reward, but as long as he's planning on playing each week, I plan on starting him. The New Orleans-Tampa Bay game was delayed for over an hour due to lightning. When the players returned to the field, it was the Saints overpowering the Bucs behind Drew Brees, who threw for 322 yards and a touchdown to Jimmy Graham, who accounted for 179 of those yards on 10 catches. There's a reason you have to draft Jimmy so much earlier than the other tight ends, and this game was just another 60 minutes of proof. He should remain the number 1 tight end throughout the year. Against rumors of locker room turmoil, Josh Freeman was terrible, only throwing for 125 yards with 1 touchdown. Even with Freeman's bad day, Vincent Jackson was still able to get 77 yards on 5 catches, somewhat salvaging what could have been an even worse night. Doug Martin, however, looked pretty good in rushing for 144 yards on 29 carries. When Martin gets over 20 touches, he's as sure as it gets to putting up double-digit fantasy points. He's going to get a lot of touches from here on out, so don't forget what I just told you. Now, unfortunately, we have to take a look at the Raiders versus the Jaguars. Outside of a couple players, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find a weaker matchup for fantasy purposes. Terrell Pryor came away with his first win as the Raiders starter, throwing for 126 yards while rushing for 50. He seems to have a stronghold on the starting quarterback job for now, so Matt Flynn will continue to do what he does best, and that is ride the pine. Darren McFadden has looked good in his first 2 games. In this one, he had 19 rushes for 129 yards while adding 4 catches for 28 yards. When healthy, McFadden can put up numbers with the best of them. Unfortunately, we have year after year of evidence that says he can't stay healthy. So we'll stay tuned, but for the time being, McFadden is looking the best he has in years. If the Jets are fantasy kryptonite, then the Jaguars are the fantasy black plague. Maurice Jones-Drew was the only fantasy relevant player on the roster, but he predictably went down with an injury this week. For now, my best advice is to stay far away from any Jacksonville player, save for maybe Cecil Shorts or possibly Justin Blackman when he returns from suspension. But in all honesty, it doesn't look good. Now let's take a look at Manning Bowl 3. The Broncos visited the Giants at Meadowlands and came away big winners. Peyton got the best of little brother Eli, throwing for 307 yards with 2 touchdowns. If there were any doubts as to whether Peyton would be able to spread the ball around like he did last week, he put those fears to rest. He looked great while managing to get all his receivers involved. Eric Decker had a solid day after missing out on the scoring party last week. He ended the day with 9 catches for 87 yards. Julius Thomas pulled in 6 catches, with 1 being for a touchdown. Thomas has proven he's a great talent and is a tight end number 1 with Peyton as his quarterback. Demaryius Thomas and Wes Welker combined for only 8 catches this week, but are still the top 2 wide receivers to own on this team. As for Eli, he wasn't so much in control. At times he looked just plain awful as he threw 4 interceptions, some of which were to wide open defensive players. Essentially playing from behind most of the game, Eli aired the ball out a lot. He was able to connect with Victor Cruz for 118 yards on 8 catches. Cruz has looked good in his first 2 games and is making a case to be a top 5 wide receiver this year. Rakeem Nicks has looked good so far. He dislocated a finger in this game, however, he had it popped back in and finished the game. As long as his injuries don't impede on his ability to run, Nicks is going to continue to play and look good while doing it. He's in a contract year and wants to prove he's put his injury woes behind him. As for the running game, David Wilson was bad for the 2nd week in a row and isn't winning anyone over in New York. Right now it's a good idea to sit him until he proves he can take on the workload. One thing that is for certain is Wilson now has to compete with Brandon Jacobs for goal line carries. Unfortunately for Wilson, Jacobs is one of the great touchdown vultures of all time. The Sunday night game saw the defending NFC champion 49ers visiting their division rival Seahawks. The Seattle defense was the real star of the game, giving little hope to anyone who started someone from the Niners this week. The Seahawks won easily, 29-3. Russell Wilson was great in controlling the Seahawks offense. He only threw 19 times, but didn't need to throw often. Marshawn Lynch was in typical beast mode, rushing 28 times for 98 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also added 3 receptions for 37 yards and another touchdown through the air. This one he caught without a 49er within 10 feet. Meanwhile, Colin Kaepernick looked nothing like the player who shredded the Packers defense a week earlier. To put it nicely, he was abysmal. His 3 interceptions completely negated any positives that came from his 87 rushing yards. However, I would put it down as more of a testament to the greatness of Seattle's defense, rather than an indictment against Kaepernick. Frank Gore couldn't get any offense going on the ground and only wound up with 16 rushing yards. After a big week 1, Anquan Boldin was a complete non-factor, while the Niners' other star, Vernon Davis, missed most of the second half with a hamstring injury. It's still unclear what the extent of Davis' injury is, but it's something we're going to have to want to keep tabs on during the week, because Davis is a pretty big part of this Niners offense, and any extended absence could be a big blow to them. Lastly, let's finish up with the Monday night game, which saw Cincinnati Bengals defeat the division rival Pittsburgh Steelers. In typical AFC North fashion, the defense reigned supreme. Andy Dalton was consistent in passing for 280 yards with a touchdown to the rookie Giovanni Bernard, who also scored a rushing touchdown. However, Bernard only saw 8 carries to BenJarvus Green-Ellis' 22. BenJarvus Green-Ellis was the better runner, racking up 75 yards on the ground. While Green-Ellis has the edge right now on Bernard, that's not saying Bernard won't get his chances. His 2 touchdown performance today makes it clear he has a role in being involved in this offense. AJ Green had a slow night against a good Pittsburgh D. In my opinion, AJ is still the unquestioned second best wide receiver, only to Calvin Johnson. Green is going to get his this year, I guarantee it, and when he does, it will come in a big way. We're just going to chalk this one up to a throwaway game. Finally, I'll make it quick for the Steelers. There's not a lot to be excited about in Steel City. Losing Maurice Pouncey in the first game will hurt this team all year. Ben Roethlisberger had a modest game with 250 yards, but the Steelers also lost starting running back Isaac Redman on the opening kickoff. Felix Jones came in for Redmond and wasn't any better. He only totaled 37 yards on 10 rushes. Emmanuel Sanders and Antonio Brown finished with 5 and 6 catches respectively. They figured to handle the bulk of the receiving duties this year, but at this point their value remains as low-end wide receiver 2s or high-end flex. It's just not a good look this year. And that's going to do it this week for ROTO Plus. Be sure to check in next week for more Fantasy Football Express.